Good evening. I'm Annalise Grice. I'm Senior Lecturer in English at Nottingham Trent University, and as Chair, I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's In Conversation event, which is on the occasion of Bonington Vitrine's exhibition at Bonington Gallery. The exhibition is called Spaces of Translation, European Magazines 1945 to 1965. And the exhibition actually closes this Saturday, 11th of March, so please do come and visit before then. Tonight, we're going to be joining Alison, Marina, and Andrew in conversation as they discuss materials they've found in their research on European periodicals post 1945. At the heart of the project is a focus upon the practice of translation. And this project asks questions such as, what is the significance of the translation of works of poetry, fiction, criticism, and non-fiction in our corpus of periodicals in this period? How do translated texts operate as vehicles for the forging of new European identities? And does the crossing of linguistic boundaries produce alliances across frontiers? So this event will last about 1 hour, and we're delighted that you can join us. Please note that tonight's event includes live automated closed captioning generated via Microsoft Teams, and this may include some mistakes. With us this evening, we have Alison E. Martin, who's Professor of British Studies at Johannes Gutenberg Universität Mainz, Germersheim, Germany. She's a specialist in translation studies, travel writing, and comparative literature. Her books include Nature Translated, Alexander von Humboldt's works in 19th century Britain of 2018, Moving Scenes, The Aesthetics of German Travel Writing on England's 1783 to 1830, published in 2008, as well as 2 co-edited volumes, Travel Writing in Dutch and German, 1790 to 1930, of 2017, and Travel Narratives in Translation, 1750 to 1830 of 2012. We've also got Marina Popea, who is a research fellow on the Spaces of Translations project. She specialises in translation and cultural magazines with a broad comparative focus. A Latin Americanist with an interdisciplinary background, she's completing an AHRC-funded PhD at Oxford University on the role of translation in shaping modern poetics in Mexican magazines of the early 20th century. And Andrew Thacker is Professor of 20th Century Literature at Nottingham Trent. He's the author or editor of several books on modernism and modernist magazines, including the 3 volumes of the Oxford Critical and Cultural History of Modernist Magazines, 2009 to 2013, and most recently, Modernism, Space and the City of 2019. He was a founder member and the first chair of BAMS, the British Association for Modernist Studies, and he's also the UK PI for the Spaces of Translation project. Okay, well, first of all, I wonder perhaps Andrew could start and tell us something about the origins of this exciting project.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Annalise. Yeah, I really it came from a meeting that I had with Alison when was it, before COVID, when I was at a conference in Germany, and we were looking at doing a research project that looked at magazines, I think, in some way, and wanted really just to look at an area that hadn't really been examined that much before. So I've worked a lot on magazines, mainly little magazines in the earlier part of the century. So I was quite happy to look at something a little bit different. And eventually, after discussions with Alison, we focused on this period of post-1945. And I think one reason we picked that was, well, really because it's foundational in terms of what happens in ideas of Europe after the war. After the war, there's just major changes in publishing across, many European countries, trying to rebuild a sense of culture and civilization after the chaos of war. it's also the moment when countries start thinking about European identity, and the foundations of the European community starts being talked about. And I guess we were also thinking of the post-Brexit context that we were in as British academics. So we wanted to go back and examine, I think, some of these ideas. And then the focus on translation is really, I've never really worked on translation, but Alison can say something more about this. He's more of an expert in translation studies. And we started to think that the role of work in magazines that is translated hasn't really been looked at that much. And after all, it's the ways in which we get to read material from languages that we wouldn't normally read, that we can't read, for example. It brings the world to us, translation, doesn't it? And magazines are one way in which that happens. So that's probably the kind of basis. I mean, Alison, you might have some other thoughts there.
Yeah, so perhaps I could just add, really, from a translation studies perspective, that the genre of the magazine is one that hasn't really been looked at in great detail. So scholars from the humanities who work in translation studies have tended to focus on the novel in translation, or drama, or poetry in translation. They've rarely tended to focus on the magazine. Primarily because of the very heterogeneous nature of the magazine itself. And we'll see that in some of the publications we're looking at today, that what they bring together are literary texts. They may also be pieces of poetry, they could be fragments of drama, but there's also more journalistic pieces of writing, pieces with a very strong political agenda from the time, pieces of biography we found. So that's one of the reasons why journals are difficult to tackle in their complexity, also because they bring together translators who themselves have very, very different backgrounds. And sort of under one umbrella, we've got this enormous variety of different voices and messages and texts being brought together. And what we've also noticed in our project is that we're not just working with texts which have just been written, which are swiftly circulating, but we're also seeing that there are historical texts which are being retranslated, revived, if you like, for a new audience. So that's also interesting. So the temporal aspect, the diachronic aspect, is really interesting for in terms of what that says also about what's considered important, what kind of message somebody from the 18th century still has for somebody in the 20th century, and particularly in the immediate post-war period.
Wonderful, thank you. I wondered whether you could say something more about the selection of the magazines. So obviously there's endless amount of magazines. How did you go about selecting particular ones to focus on?
I think that's the question that we're actually most commonly asked when it comes to our project, isn't it? And as you said, there were endless numbers of magazines, and that's not really an exaggeration. I mean, for the German context, immediately after the end of the war, there literally are hundreds of magazines which are brought onto the market. Some of them are incredibly short-lived. Some of them only last one issue or maybe two, and some for slightly longer. And what we were interested in doing was bringing together some of those sort of little magazines, we might call, in terms of their run, quite short run magazines, and we'll see some of those in later slides. But also magazines which are still being published today. So that's one aspect of what we were looking at, some which were very short-lived and the others which are still very influential as commentators on society today. So that was one of the aspects. But Andrew, you want to comment on more, I'm sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the other thing, we look at three language areas. So we're looking at magazines published in Britain, Germany and France, and that was partly because we felt we could cover those language areas in our expertise, and also it made it manageable. And then we've picked 6, didn't we, from each of the language area, or do we've
Well, we
moved?
started off with 8.
Started of 8, and then we've kind of
8 for each
moved down
area.
to about 6 from each. And it's really because, as Alison said, there is just so many. I mean, France, there's another kind of a massive resurgence in French publishing in magazines after the liberation. Britain as well. I think there's another kind of attempt to do more. So we looked really at magazines that started after 1945 or around about that. We didn't want to look at ones that had been going beforehand and then kept publishing. So it was the kind of newness, the new experience of the post-war world, I think we wanted to capture in these. Then we did a lot of looking around at the contents, which had the most, that had translation in. Some of the magazines were ones that just, we knew the name of. They were big, familiar. Lettres Modernes, the French one was really well known. Encounter, the British one. But it was looking and thinking, well, these look interesting from a translation point of view. So let's pick that one. And go ahead and look at that one. Also, I suppose different kinds of styles and genres. I mean, Alison's got one that she'll talk about later, which is kind of like a Reader's Digest type magazine. So we wanted not just literary, but different formats of magazine, just to get the sense of, the translation activity in magazines going across all kinds of genre of magazine.
Lovely.
We can add also at this point, as Andrew said, we were looking at English language, French and German language magazines, but we were also interested in bilingualism in these magazines. So we've got a couple that are actually bilingual, that include 2 or more languages in them. And we're thinking about what kind of challenges they pose for the reader, or what kind of readership they were seeking to attract. So we were also interested in how these journals sort of position themselves on the market, what their strategy is. And that's another reason for taking magazines that appear after the war, because many of them have quite clear strategic statements about where they see themselves in the market, in the European market, but also in the national market in that period.
Wonderful. So huge amount of scoping activity going off to start this project. Why translation as a focus in particular? Why is the project kind of centered upon translation?
The first answer would be because translation, of course, is about the movement of texts and ideas. Yeah, so it's about bringing authors to an audience that, without knowledge of that particular foreign language, wouldn't be able to read and be aware of the ideas and the concepts being discussed in those texts. But also because we felt that translators were mediating individuals who have been largely overlooked in the history of periodical publishing. So obviously work had been done on editors, work had been done on authors, but little had been done on translators in this particular genre.
Yeah,
Also,
there's a kind of key concept in translation studies from theorists many years ago about the invisible translator, which is partly about the idea of best translations, the ones where you can't feel it. But the other aspect of it is that, the work of translators is enormous. And often, some of the magazines we've looked at, clearly work has been translated, but there's no named translator. So they are invisible, quite literally. Somebody has done the translation work, and they may have been paid, they may not have been, but they're written out of history. So some of the projects are trying to recover, I think, some of that hidden work as well.
Lovely. Marina, did you have anything else to add there?
Yes, also adding to what Alison was just saying, I think that the post-World War II context also is a very interesting moment to look at translation, because there is a dialogue there to be put back together. There is bridges to be rebuilt, and translation is one of the ways in which those communities that had not been talking for a certain number of years will reconnect and recognize common ground in certain aspects, And that's also where the topic of European identity comes in this project, as well as the topic of exiles and those individuals who translate, who are often from communities that have been displaced or that exist in between the different national and linguistic entities in Europe. So I think we'll be talking a bit more about this in a minute.
Wonderful, thank you. What is the role of the Congress for Cultural Freedom? I can see this on the slide here. Would you like to say a little bit more about the role of the Congress for Cultural Freedom?
Yeah, is that up? Is it in kind of full screen? Is it? Because on mine it's just in the small mode. Is Alex? Is it? It's okay. Yeah, great. Right. So the Congress for Cultural Freedom. We found that this organization started in 1951 and published, as you can see on the screen here, about 50 magazines, and they were also involved in a number of exhibitions, artworks, displays, other kinds of activities. They were part of the Cold War, the division of the post-war world into, that's kind of, just to say this simply, between a kind of bloc that was based around the Soviet Union and communism, and the other bloc based around notions of liberalism, capitalism, and run really led by America. So the Congress for Cultural Freedom was an organization that was started in Berlin, and then it had its headquarters in Paris, and they were promoting the idea of cultural freedom in order to really position the West as the protectors of cultural freedom against the threat of communism. It eventually becomes transparent by the 1960s, though a number of people already knew this, that they were funded by and large by the CIA in America as part of the Cold War to stop the Soviet influence in matters of culture, and then on into politics. So a massively kind of networked organization doing all kinds of different activities, and we found that there were 3 magazines that we've looked at that were funded by them quite directly in ways. So yeah, massively important, really. I'm just going to go and open the door. So over to somebody else.
Okay, I'll pick up from here, and also mention that the Congress for Cultural Freedom has had this purpose of really disseminating their ideas very broadly and reaching a broad audience, and that meant that they did, as Andrew mentioned, organize events, exhibition, workshops, but they also published brochures and magazines that were more literary oriented, but magazines also that were kind of more in terms of presenting news and more political contents. So it was really a very, very big operation, and a very complicated operation in terms of how it was structured, because the whole thing was a front of the CIA, but most of the people who were working for it were not aware of the whole origins and purpose of the organization. So it really creates this cultural or propaganda creating kind of machine that is fascinating in the ways that it works, and in the ways that it also uses translations in a very peculiar manner, because they do need to get the word out and to move text as much as possible within the European space and even beyond.
Wonderful, thank you. And thinking about the archive, what have you found in the archive? Shall we dig into some of the magazines that you've looked at?
Yes.
So I think, Alex, just to move us on to the next slide, please.
There we go. So our colleague Dana Steglich and me had the opportunity last summer to actually visit the archive of the Center for Cultural Freedom at the University of Chicago. And we were looking mainly for ways in which the publication of the associated magazines worked. And especially, we were looking for clues as to how they used translation and who commissioned the texts. Did the different magazines that were published under the Congress collaborate? Did they share texts? We noticed, for instance, that the text that actually appears in issue 52 of Preuve, which is a magazine of the CCF, by Arthur Koestler, La Bombache et le Dinosaure, is actually a translation from English. It was also published in Encounter and in the Monats, which are the other two magazines that we're looking at that were funded by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And we find those instances in which the texts moved between magazines. So that's one of the things that we looked at in the archive. We did find numerous instances in which, especially the director of Preuve was also the director of publications for the whole CCF, although his role as director of publications was pretty limited. But he definitely worked hard to move texts and to offer text to translate to other CCF magazines, to take texts from them and translate them into French, and also offer them to other publications that are not part of this network, but that might be interested in sharing those things. Another thing that is interesting about Preuve, now that we're actually looking at it, is the covers, and we find those covers, especially the dinosaur one. We've been commenting a lot about it because it is just a really attractive kind of cover and an intriguing catch cover that relates directly to kind of like the text that they are trying to put really forward, which is Koestler's. And as well, in the archive, we've seen quite a few cases in which the actually CIA agent who is in charge of the whole operation writes to the editors to tell them that he doesn't like the covers and that he needs covers that are kind of like more engaging and more lively, and that they should pay attention to the colors that they use and really make them more appealing, so that they would catch the attention on the newsstand. And we get this interesting intersection between periodical culture and what you want to do when you're producing a cultural object that has to attract a readership and has to be appealing, and also producing a form of political propaganda that at the same time wants to be more or less hidden and wants to look like pretty standard cultural product. So there's a lot of things that we've found in the archive that are really small details, but that tell us how the editors and the higher ups within the Center, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, did view translation and did view their editorial activity. We've also found a lot about the relationship between the magazines, and maybe we could look at the next slide, which features, so one of the images is a small kind of like ad that would be inserted within the pages of the magazines, and that really promotes the work of the Congress and its other publications to the reader. We also see various moments when the editorial teams of various of the magazines that were funded by the CCF will exchange lists of possible subscribers, so that they could reach the audiences across borders. The other thing that's really interesting, and that's the letter that is fitted here, is really how translations were made to happen, basically. So in this case, we have a really interesting situation in which the director of publications of Preuve reads a short story by Polish author Witold Gombrowicz, and he wants it translated in French. So in the first place, he does read it in translation. I'm not sure whether that is in another of the CCF magazines or not. But that is what prompts the whole thing. And so he contacts Konstantin Jelensky, who is also Polish and who works for the Congress for Cultural Freedom, but in another area of the Congress. And Kurt is tasked with finding a translator, because it is not particularly easy in Paris to find a good translator from Polish necessarily at the time. There are various translators from Polish, but it is through those contacts of exiles that you find the right person for the translation. And so the translation is attributed to this Polish translator, and it's also paid for by actually a scholarship for exiled writers. So again, we have this overlap between what is a normal magazine that will pay for its contributors, and also this situation of programs of funding that is being thrown at Eastern European communities and the Cultural Cold War effort in Europe that is used to actually kind of like produce the translations, which we found was quite notable. I think that is all on Preuve now.
Okay, if we can move on then maybe to Der Monat, that would be the next slide. Der Monat, the month, eine internationale Zeitschrift. So there we see the claim on the title page that this is an international journal, and that's very much what it was. It was a journal started in 48, it ran till 71, so it had a long run, 23 years. And in it brought together voices really from across the globe. So people from Bombay, Mexico City, Helsinki, Shanghai, Buenos Aires would be reporting back on various political events. But we can also see from that title page that it included more literary pieces. Scott Fitzgerald, for example, is mentioned there. And so translation was actually a core and a key part of this journal. Rather frustratingly, though, this was also a journal in which the names of the translators are very rarely mentioned. So we know that translation is central, absolutely key to the undertaking, but we don't know on the face of it, without going into the archives, who some of the translators might have been. And that's the work that's been undertaken by Dana Stedlich as part of this project. Der Monat is a journal which is launched by or edited by Melvin Lasky, who, in terms of his profile, is typical of an editor working in Germany at the time. It's published in Berlin and in Munich, and it's published under the auspices of the American controlling forces. And basically, they sought to take figures as editors who had obviously had a knowledge of German, who had maybe, as Lasky had done, followed US Army operations during World War II. These were people who were considered politically unproblematic, or people who were quite clearly on the side of the Allied forces, so that they would also be conveying the right kind of political message when it came to the re-education. That's a really key word in Germany at this time, the re-education of the German readership in the immediate post-war period. And Lasky, in terms of his political orientation, was somebody who had quite a clear take on the Cold War and how to win the Cold War, and this is precisely the right kind of person that the American authorities would want to be editing this kind of magazine. Marina was talking a couple of slides back about the visual attraction of the magazine, we saw that wonderful dinosaur with its really interesting kind of perspective. We go from the tail in through to the head, and it was a really striking cover. What's interesting about Der Monat is that, you know, quite the opposite is the case. I mean, we've got a wonderful brown example here, that it actually looks quite, you know, visually quite boring, and yet despite that, it has this long print run. But we'll come back to that maybe a bit later, or in fact in the next slide, when we're talking about Encounter. I think, Andrew, you want to talk something about the visual attraction.
No, I could just say something. I just wanted to add something with the last one. We don't need to see the image though, but you know, it is remarkable that Lasky, I think, is a really interesting figure. He's American, and you know, but he's from a German family, but you know, comes over, very much interested in transatlantic politics. That's the focus of what he wants. He wants to bring together Europe and America, which was a big kind of thing in Cold War diplomacy at that point. And one of the things about Der Monat, as you said, you know, it looks quite dull, but it did have a big print run. It was one of the best-selling magazines in Germany in this point. But I found something the other day which was really interesting, that they would, partly because they had the money behind them, they used to not only sell the magazine, but they were also distribute it in some quite interesting places. So one of the places they distributed large numbers of copies of it was in the many camps for displaced persons that existed in Germany and Central Europe after the war. And so there was a bit of the archives, I think, that Dana had found, where she said, you know, they said, oh yeah, and there's so many thousand are distributed in these displaced persons camps. So again, you know, they were thinking, okay, as Alison said, about kind of re-education for the German people after the war, and you know, giving away, I think, free magazines of this was part of it. But we moved on now to Encounter, which was the English CCF magazine, published between 1953 and 1991. And this was one that they took a long time to get off the ground, but they wanted an American magazine, so they wanted a British magazine. One of the editors was British, and that was Stephen Spender, and the other editor was an American. And in a sense, this magazine had two parts to it. One was the cultural literary material, which Spender, as a quite famous English poet at this point, was in charge of. And the more political, sociological, historical material was mainly run by the American editor. The first one was a guy called Irving Kristol, again with CCF connections, but then Lasky took over when they felt the magazine needed to be pushed a little bit more. One of the things about Encounter was, amongst kind of a number of readers on the British left at the point, they said, oh, it's just too American, it's too pro-American, little without really knowing that it was being funded by the CIA. One of the things I think that's interesting, again, going back to the look of the magazines, we can see here two covers that at the start, the second issue, and then the 89th issue from 1961, just what has happened in kind of 8 years, really. A magazine that looks very solid and serious, and it says it's literature, art and politics on the left. Again, we have Arthur Koestler, and I think the second piece there, the political neurosis piece, is the same piece that we had in Der Monat. So again, it's the same characters weaving through those. But by the time you get to 1961, this is a really kind of nice looking cover. It's one that, you know, nice use of colour, some really interesting contents. Claude Lévi-Strauss, this is a major work of anthropology that they had in translation. Koestler again, and you know, it's a kind of different magazine, and I think that's partly Lasky, because I think Lasky comes in and says, right, let's make this more interesting, you know, just from the start, from the cover. This issue number 89 is quite an interesting one as well, because you've got all the contents there that you know, contributors, topics and whatever. One of the things I found in this magazine when I was flicking through it was actually it's got a poem by Sylvia Plath in it. Quite an early poem by Sylvia Plath, the American poet, famous poet. But she doesn't appear on the contents page as if she'd suddenly somehow been forgotten, because they are quite the CCF itself and many of the editors are very kind of much dominated by men at this point, though there are these kind of, some women contributors. So we just move on to the next slide and we'll finish with this little bit if we can. So just a photo of Stephen Spender. As I said, Spender was a famous poet from the pre-war period, associated with people like W.H. Auden, very left thinking in that period, as many of the writers in Britain were. Becomes after the war slightly more disillusioned by left politics, and that's probably why the CCF approached him to edit the magazine. He's also employed by UNESCO as a cultural attaché for a little while. And he knew Germany very well and Austria from travelling there in the 30s and travelled again there after the war in 1945. So always very interested in European identity. And I think he saw Encounter as a way very much of bringing together, again, European voices and also voices from the rest of the world. And they started a translation prize for non-European languages. Spender didn't know that the funding for this magazine came from the CIA. And when it was revealed in the 1960s, he was aghast and resigned. And said, I knew nothing about it. A number of other people said to him, you must have known. All the rest of us had suspicions. But Spender always, till his day, and his widow also said, that he just didn't. Whether he was just naive, I don't know. But yeah. So that's kind of a little chunk about the CCF magazines there.
It's interesting also how it ties in with the notion of translation, because as you said, Andrew, Spender was in charge of the literary part of the magazine, and he really pushed that kind of like that literary side in comparison with other CCF magazines that are much more political, and we see that in terms of the genres of the texts that are being translated in each of these magazines. And in Encounter, poetry and fictional prose have a space that they do not have in other CCF magazines. And in terms of translation, this also has to, it comes along with having translators that are identified more often in Encounter than they are in other magazines, in which translation is used in such an instrumental way to really kind of like produce content and move it around as much as possible, which is really interesting in many ways, because we have found that problem with both Der Monat and Preuve, that we cannot find who the translators are, and that is not something that we're encountering with Encounter.
Yeah.
Would you like to say anything more about the French magazines that you've been working on?
Yeah, if we move on to the next slide, Alex, we've got an example of a couple that we're looking at here. So these are two really interesting magazines published in Paris after the war. On the left is perhaps one of the most famous ones for anybody that knows kind of French cultural life after the war. So this is Les Temps Modernes, Modern Times, named after a Charlie Chaplin film, which was edited by the famous French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre for 45 when it was founded till 1980. The other key editorial name here is his partner again, the major feminist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. And you look at the issue we've got here from 1947, and it's just an amazing array. You get Sartre writing an essay on what is literature, which is a key bit of Marxist literary theory. You get a translation from Richard Wright, and we'll just say something about him in a minute, a major American novelist. Simone de Beauvoir writing about feminist ethics. And then the last guy there is a kind of minor surrealist there. So it's kind of, it was a very radical magazine for its time in terms of its politics. Sartre pushed a very kind of radical decolonial line, a very left agenda, quite complex in terms of its support for communism and really against all the things that the CCF magazine was standing for. And then on the right, and I think Marina would say something, or should I just introduce
Yes.
this one? Yeah, Présence
Yes.
africaine.
Yeah, so you have another of the really kind of like big or important publications in the post-war context, and that is Présence africaine, which is edited by Alioune Diop, and it brings together African intellectuals, but also Black writers from a variety of countries, the United States, the Caribbean, and Europe. And it's one of those really important voices of post-colonial thought in post-war France, which is something that we are seeing kind of like emerge with force in this magazine. In terms of translation, again, we have various lines that are present in this magazine. One of them is the translation of African writers, and especially of folk tales and of the oral tradition from different African countries, giving it a sort of kind of like literary status, as well as the value in terms of how intellectuals at the time are rethinking the humanist values and the basis on which European identity is constructed. We also have a number of translations of anthropological texts that look at those aspects in African societies. And we also have translations of literature, in particular, of Black writers from the US and the Caribbean. We have Langston Hughes, Nicolas Guillen from Cuba, and Richard Wright, whom I think we'll talk about now.
Yeah, it's a super magazine. I mean, we should say one of the things we've been doing is keeping account of how many different languages are translated in our magazines. And, one of the things we found in Présence Africaine was that they were translating very small African languages. And that was quite exciting to find that. And I think we're up to, what are we up to? About 63?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, about 63 different languages are translated in the group of magazines. So you can see that though we're looking at 3 magazines and language areas, it's translated all kinds of the different material. This is just an image of Richard Wright, who we've just mentioned here, and this is a kind of different way in which transatlantic, transnational links are made. Wright was a famous American novelist for 2 novels in particular, Native Son, and the other was more autobiographical book called Black Boy. A kind of linked to the Harlem Renaissance in some ways, but a later version of it. But Wright moves to live in Paris after the war and becomes a kind of celebrated Black intellectual, both in his writings, but also his kind of political views. So sure enough, he gets translated in Sartre's magazine, the Le Temps Moderne, and he also appears on the kind of editorial board of Présence Africaine. So it's the kind of making links across a kind of Black intellectual diaspora, really, finding Wright and Wright's works being translated in these magazines. So that's kind of, some of the work we've found, I think, in some of the French magazines there.
Wonderful, thank you. And you mentioned de Beauvoir. I wondered whether you wanted to say anything more about women and translation. It's International Women's Day today, but it'd be lovely to hear a little bit more about women, the role of women in translation.
Well, if we jot down the slides, Alex, to the one with the 2 women there, Alison, do you want to say something to kick us off? Or?
Well, yes, okay, so I can say something briefly about the fact that women are, of course, present as translators in these magazines. When it comes to the German corpus, if we look in the kind of the top 20 of our translators, only 3 women are present. They're present to some degree because one of them is an editor, one of them is the wife of quite a well-known critical journalist at the time. What we've been trying to do in this project is to kind of move these women more into a kind of center stage position rather than simply being wife of, to try and understand more about their biographies as really quite key figures in these magazines. So I think, Andrew, you're going to say something about three women who are themselves translators, and then I'd like to say something about another woman who we've got on the next slide, who is also integral to the process of translation in another way.
Yeah, I mean, as Alison said, this is another case of the kind of the invisible translator that we wanted to bring to the fore. Darina Salone is an Irish woman that studied modern languages in France, and then this is she met an Italian writer called Ignazio Siloni, who actually edited one of the CCF magazines for Italy, but she did all his translation work, and he was quite specific about only allowing her to do it. I think that's right, Marina, isn't it? That he...
Yes, she was his personal translator.
Yeah,
and
personal translator.
They would normally not make exceptions.
Yeah, but a kind of an interesting figure, I think, for a work otherwise. Geneviève Serrault translated across a number of the post-war French magazines. She also became a playwright, an actor and a filmmaker later on, but I think her early career was very much as a translator, doing literary translations, sometimes of Brecht, I think, in some of the early ones. I kind of like this photo because it's very French. I think, probably why I picked that. It could only be a kind of French translator. And if we move on to the next two women, Ruth Spears is a kind of really interesting figure who translated the German poet Rilke, but she was Latvian, who, through a kind of very complex story, found herself during the Second World War in Egypt with a group of British kind of people, forces, cultural figures that were in Alexandria. And through that set of connections, gradually starts to translate Rilke. And then she comes back to the UK and continues doing kind of translation work. So it's quite difficult to find information about her, we found, but we're trying to bring her back. And then Bella Bachem, Alison's going to talk about.
I'd like to say something about Bella Bachem. We got this wonderful photo of her, and we can also see her signature at the bottom. We see this hand writing her name, and that actually already kind of points to what she is, and that is that she's an illustrator, she's an artist, she's not a translator. But what's interesting about her for me is that she is the illustrator of translated work. So what we see in these magazines, and I'm thinking particularly of Carousel, which was a magazine which brought artists and literary writers into dialogue with each other, is that artists are also central to drawing attention to translation. Bella Bachem was the woman who illustrated a translation of a short story by Vita Sackville-West. So what we see in one of these periodicals is Vita essentially in dialogue with her German translator. It's a man, it's Hans Wagenseil, and we've also got another voice coming into this, a kind of a visual voice, if you like, and that's Bella Bachem, who was an illustrator. And she has an interesting history to her, and that is that she is now regarded as one of the most influential surrealist literary illustrators of the day, but she was quickly denounced by the National Socialists, and so public exhibitions of her work were banned. And she started publishing in Carousel, which is launched in 48, and it's a platform, it's a forum for her to get her work back out there, to get herself noticed, and it's a way to relaunch her career. So there's all sorts of communities of people and constellations coming together in these magazines that we're keen to look at in more detail.
Also, just adding a small detail to what I was discussing towards the beginning about that letter and the translation of Gombrowicz's short story. It was also illustrated by, I think, a Polish artist, And again, we have those communities coming together around kind of the production and the presentation of the translations within the magazines. And those communities involved often women who are, to a large extent, there's a really big tension between the visibility that they have in the magazines and all the work that they do behind the scenes, as we've found in the archive. So that those communities of either women or different waves of diaspora, or actually both of them, as in the case of Ruth Spears.
Wonderful, thank you. And how does the immediate aftermath of the war affect these magazines? So how is Germany different from France or Britain?
So if we go, Alex, to the one the chicken cover, which we which the curator at the Bonington, Josh, is very keen on. So we've got a couple of magazines here that I think Alison knows more about because of the context of those. But I mean, one of the things to say about Germany, that Germany was divided up immediately after war into different zones by the occupying powers. And that somehow shaped, to some extent, some of the productions there, I think. So Carousel is one of the ones that's the nicest in terms of its covers as well.
Yeah. So Western Germany is sort of carved up by the Allies into an American zone, British zone, and a French zone. And the occupying forces have their own cultural agendas, of course, in terms of what kind of works are translated, from which languages they come. So obviously in the French occupying zone, we've got a large proportion of Francophone writers whose works are translated. The same to some degree applies to the American and British zones, although I think there's a greater range. They're more multilingual in terms of the origins of the texts that are translated. What is important is the vetting of the people who contribute to these journals, which isn't the case in the British and the French contexts. We've mentioned that the editors are very closely vetted before that they can launch the journal, but the same also applies to the people who contribute. What's interesting about Carousel is that it's a highly visual magazine, as we can see here, and what's important is that it aims to bring cutting-edge artists and writers and translators together. These are people who are individuals with a vision for post-war Germany, and none other than Arnold Bauder. He was the person who designed the cover you can see on the left-hand side. That's the first issue of Das Karussell, and he was a figure who was absolutely central to the launching of the Documenta, which is an art exhibition which continues to this day. It's highly international, highly provocative, political, and the kind of work he was producing here sort of forewarns of what he intends for the aesthetic and artistic literary scene in Western Germany through the 50s and 60s. These covers are very striking, but they're actually, in terms of print technology, quite easy to produce because they're three-tone images. And if you were to see how Kassel, which is where the journal was issued from, I mean, Kassel was bombed to about 85% of its area because it was an industrial city, and so it's quite astonishing with that at the back of your mind to see what they were able to produce with, as I said, with relatively poor print technology at the time, but with a huge amount of energy and vision.
Wonderful. So
and then it's the next one, just one other example there is the Neue Auslese, and that's the one we were saying was the kind of Reader's Digest form.
So it has precisely that form. It's a selection of smaller literary and non-fictional pieces. What's interesting about this cover, this is from the 1950s, it's one of the last issues that we see, is it's got a photograph on it, it's of Times Square. So it's very much, I suppose, about the Americanization of British culture. It looks very modern. Earlier issues were much plainer. They were much more like Der Monat that we saw several slides back. And Neue Alsleder had to keep on reinventing itself visually to kind of keep pace with journals like Reader's Digest, the Reader's Digest that we know today, that had also come onto the German market in the late 1940s, and with which Neue Auslese was competing very heavily, and it lost out. I mean, so yeah, by 1950, Neue Auslese had folded, whereas Reader's Digest continues to this day.
Wonderful. And you mentioned Beckett earlier, and Beckett's a feature of the exhibition. I wondered whether you wanted to say anything more about Beckett and translation.
Yeah. So I think this is the slide. Yep. Yeah, one of the things we noticed was Beckett appears in this magazine in particular, Les Lettres Nouvelles, New Letters, 1953-1977, which is a kind of really important literary cultural magazine of ideas. Quite a small one. This one point was a weekly magazine, so it's a tremendous amount of work for an editor and the contributors. But Beckett, of course, is an Irish playwright, a Nobel Prize winner, born in Dublin, leaves to work to study in France. During the war, he becomes a member of the resistance, doing some amazing work there, which only became known relatively recently. And then after the war, starts writing in the, if anybody knows Beckett's work, it's the most extraordinary kind of style of writing novels, and particularly plays, which sometimes was linked to the theatre of the absurd movement. Beckett starts writing in French. But then at various points in the 50s and 60s moves to English and then moves back to French. So he's working very much across the languages. And what we found in this magazine, that they published in translation 2 of his plays, because at this moment he was writing back into English, but then having the stuff translation. And sometimes he would translate himself. So 2 of the plays here, this one is Cendre, which in English is Embers. And then the other one that we have a little clip of in the exhibition is a play called Krapp's Last Tape, which is an amazing piece of monologue by a guy looking back on his life. He does it by playing tapes on an old recorder that he does on his birthday. And he goes, oh, I don't remember that. Or did I do that? So it's very much about kind of memory and so on. And I think what is interesting finding Beckett in here is, all sorts of things. But one is that Beckett was much more valued in France before he became valued as in Britain or the Anglophone world. So the work of these magazines, I think, was a real outlet for a writer like Beckett, working across languages, a kind of transnational figure, but very much capturing the post-war mood, of trying to deal with what had happened with the war, trying to find a new vision for, European identity as well, for him. So, we just thought it was a kind of nice find there to find the Beckett stuff there. And another nice image of somebody hanging around a Parisian cafe there. Great photo.
Thank you. Fantastic. Well, we'll draw things to a close shortly, but one final question, which is any reflections on any work that needs to be done? What could be done in the future? For any budding PhD students out there listening in, what topics need more work in the future?
Gosh, well, I think the project like this throws up a whole series of things that you can follow on more. With, like you said, PhD topics would be great. I mean, I think the work of the CCF and translation would be one. I think what they were trying to do with translated works. The magazines, other than that, these ones are more well known, and some of the others I think are less well known. So that would be interesting. The work of individual translators, I think, could well be a focus. We talked about women in translations. Just the amount of translated material here. I mean, one of the other things that we've been doing, and Marina's been doing, is a much more digital humanities type approach, where we're looking at the data that were collected and trying to think about ways in which we can visualize, for example, where translators came from in the world, the amount from particular countries, and so on. So yeah, that's just off the top of my head 3 things that we could do. I'm sure the other 2 would have other ideas.
Yeah, I think the centrality of translation in exile communities in this period. So Marina's already mentioned that. I mean, I think that's something that it's important to stress, that translators were extremely nomadic figures. The writers too, but also the illustrators. There's an awful lot of movement going on for political reasons. And even when they've arrived in a particular city, let's take London, for example, which was home to thousands of German and Austrian refugee and emigre writers from 1933 onwards. Even within London, they'd constantly be moving around because they could only stay with people for a certain amount of time. Yet despite that sort of constant upheaval, they were still managing to forge, carve out a profession for themselves as a translator. So I think that's very interesting, the exile and translation, and how these 2 ideas are brought together. But also more general, as you said, Andrew, when we think about the translator's oeuvre, we tend to think about the books that they've translated, because that's what's easiest to find, after all, in a library catalogue. That's if the catalogue gives details of a translator. But it's less the case that, that translations and contributions to journals have been looked at by scholarly translation studies.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, we're nearing the hour now, so we will draw this event to a close, but I'd really like to thank Alison, Marina and Andrew for their time this evening and for introducing us to this absolutely fascinating project. And there's so much more we could have said, I think. I'm sure we all look forward to hearing more in due course. And thank you to the viewers who have watched tonight's In Conversation via YouTube.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.